Hello, Jim 12's here again. This time a reflection on education. Today is the 18th of February 2026 and this is the third in my series of reflections on my book While We Were Sleeping, A Wake-Up Call for All Christians, published on Amazon. Incidentally, before I get going, may I encourage you to press a like if you do, and make a comment if you do or you don't, and subscribe to the channel if you think this might be of benefit to you in the future. So let's get going. Education. Yeah, arguably I would say it's an overused word and potentially misunderstood. So what is education? I'll never forget my chemistry teacher quoting from an earlier philosopher, I think, and he told us that education is everything we've got left after we've forgotten everything we ever learnt. I really love that. Education is what we've got left after we've forgotten everything we ever learnt. Have a think. So, to me, education is not what we know, because that is so easily accessible, the what. Any question can be answered by a voice or a click of a few keys on a keyboard. I'm really interested in how we learn, how an adult or a child learns, and basically how they think. I think how they think is a really important thing to think about, because if we don't think deeply, how can we learn? And many other follow-ons from that. My third thought about education, goes to the forest kindergarten. And you may have heard of these things, but basically when kids start school, for example in Denmark, and I'll put a link below, when they start school in Denmark, they don't go to school. They go to the forest, and a bunch of 30 kids and a couple of teachers will take them on an adventure through the forest. And I'm particularly impressed they take them on whatever the weather. There's no fair weather education, so if it's snowing, out they go in the snow. If it's really hot, out they go in the hot. A related aspect to that sort of education, which I think is fantastic, is field trips. Now, in my earlier career, I used to love field trips, particularly residential ones, and I would take my year 11 and 12s on a week-long residential at Easter time-ish, either in England, Wales or Scotland, or overseas onto the continent. And it was pivotal, and I would argue foundational, formational for many of the students I had, to actually learn through their boots. I would love to think that students can find a joy in learning and problem solving. And it irks me a little when I discover that some teachers will give kids a longer recess if they do really well. In other words, they do less learning, or they'll send them onto a computer to play some computer games if they've finished their work. Now, to me, that is not sending the right message. Education should be about birthing a joy of learning, lifelong learning in the young heart. Are children being child-minded? Is that what education is? Somewhere to put them while we go to work? Are they being entertained and having fun, and that's the most important thing about education? Nah, I don't think so. That's not education. Peer group pressure, particularly in the teens, is incredibly strong, as I'm sure we all know. And I've heard it analysed that it is actually more powerful than the influence of the family on average. So if that's the case, parents have a huge learning curve to work out how to navigate this when they know that their children are being influenced by their peers so effectively and so pervasively and subliminally, I would argue. What are the families that have values and principles doing to combat that? I want to talk about competency-based learning. You know the sort where students have to reach a certain level to get the tick on that competence. I would argue that that isn't education. That's training. And anybody who needs a skill, an electrician, a plumber, needs to learn competence in various tasks, and it's a gradation, and fine and absolutely essential, but it's not education. And I come back to it. Education is how we think. It's what we've got left after we've forgotten everything we ever learnt. So that's not competence. Competence is a skill that we either have in our heads or in our hands. Yeah, that's a training, not to be confused with education. I want to mention communities of practice. One of the people I've really admired in education is a man called, a Swiss man called Etienne Wenger. And he came up with this concept of communities of practice, particularly initially applied to the medical profession, where if you can imagine individuals with passion and skill become part of a community, and over the water cooler or over a coffee, ideas get sparked and thinking gets massaged, so much so that the sum of the parts is greater than the individual components, which I think is absolutely fundamental part of education. So I think it's really hard to learn in isolation on a desert island, although obviously you would. You'd certainly learn the skills and the competences of survival. But imagine a teaching community, a staff room of like-minded, passionate people who are spurring each other on in their craft and coming up with new ideas. Oh, I never thought of doing that way. Wow, fantastic, let's do it. So I've put a link down to Etienne Wenger below in the comments. Communities of practice. I would argue in the staff room of a school, in a classroom, in a community who are learning. I think it's a fantastic model. Look into it. Growing in responsibility. I really love, actually I'll give you a picture from Jordan Peterson. He talked about looking after his grandchildren. And he came to one of his grandchildren and said, let's lay the table for the meal. And so he says to the kid who's never done this before, go on, lay the table. The kid has no idea. No idea. So Jordan says, first of all, he said, right, here are the spoons. Watch me, and I'll place out the spoons, and you do the rest. So it's a gradation of responsibility as time goes through education. And I love that. And I used to say to my students, it's really working when the student can say to the teacher, you're redundant, I don't need you anymore, I know how to learn, I know where to go from here, you've done your job, I'm now responsible for my own education, I don't need you on my back. That would be fantastic if your students said to you, you're redundant, go and have a coffee, we've got this. Fantastic. So, but that takes a huge amount of step by step increments of growing in their responsibility. My last thought, well, it's actually two together. Critical thinking and the scientific method. Critical thinking, it's potentially hard to define, but I think it works just as those two terms. It's thinking in a critical way and not a naive way, not a simple sponge, believing everything you hear. You've got to test it, look at it from different angles, measure it, see where that source came from. Is it to be trusted? What about that against that? Comparing and contrasting. Critical thinking is really essential, and I would love to see it much more part of education than it apparently is these days. And allied to that, the scientific method. The scientific method is putting up a hypothesis which you set out to disprove. And once you've disproved that hypothesis, you then set up another hypothesis and test that. In other words, the scientific method can never be called the science is now settled. What would have happened if the scientists had said, when the world was believed to be flat, the science is now settled, we're never going to explore anything else? That would be ridiculous. So the scientific method is so dynamic and so designed to allow and encourage new ideas, a new perspective, a new experiment to test something, to see if it's really true. So critical thinking and the scientific method, I would argue, need to be front and centre of any education, be it in a school, in the home, in an apprenticeship situation. Anyway, enough said, I've gone on too long. Education, it's been my life, and I commend those thoughts to you, and I would love you to go down there and write some comments about what you think education is and where you think I might have gone wrong, because I'm pretty sure I have. Thanks a lot, and bye for now.